Mike Denton stood in the empty living room of apartment 412, nodding along as the property manager rattled off the usual spiel about utilities and parking. The place wasn't much, just another cookie-cutter unit in a converted textile factory from the 1920s. But after 3 months of crashing on his buddy Steve's couch, it felt like the Ritz-Carlton. Each morning, Mike's routine started at 5 a.m. at the Milwaukee Uniform Service warehouse. He'd sort through racks of pressed uniforms, mechanic coveralls, chef whites, hospital scrubs, each tagged and organized by route. The mindless organization helped, gave structure to his newly chaotic life. Sometimes he'd catch himself arranging the hangers with obsessive precision. Anything to keep his mind from wandering back to Jessica, or worse, to what waited for him in room 7. At 40, Mike's dark hair had started graying at the temples, and long hours in the delivery van had added a slight slouch to his 6-foot frame. Jessica used to tease him about his dad bod, back when teasing was still affectionate. Now, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, he noticed how the shadows under his eyes had deepened, how his face had taken on the gaunt, haunted look of someone carrying too many secrets. The windows in apartment 412 were tall and narrow, industrial relics that let in thin strips of light during the day, and whistled with every wind gust at night. The floors had that particular slope old buildings get, as if the whole place was slowly sinking into its own history. In the kitchen, the linoleum was peeling at the corners, revealing layers of older flooring beneath, like archaeological strata, each layer telling its own stories of past tenants and their lives. The thing about divorce is how it questions your memories. Did Jessica ever really love him? Were the good times as good as he remembered? These doubts plagued Mike, growing stronger with each sleepless night, until he wasn't sure what was real anymore. And maybe that's why he didn't immediately run when the talking started. When you're already questioning your reality, what's one more impossibility? The heat's included. The manager, a heavy-set woman named Barbara, wheezed as she climbed the stairs. And the walls are thick. They're original brick. You won't hear the neighbors. Mike ran his hand along the exposed brick, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingertips. The apartment had that particular smell of fresh paint trying to cover decades of Milwaukee winters. 7 rooms in total. Living room, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a weird little study nook, and what Barbara called a bonus room. Basically a glorified closet with a window. Mike had always thought divorce would feel like a death, but he was wrong. Death had finality. This felt more like a haunting. Memories that refused to fade. Guilt that wouldn't quiet down. And maybe that's why he had chosen this place. Something in him recognized it was already haunted, and misery, as they say, loves company. "I'll take it," he said before she could launch into another speech about the building's history. That night, laying on his air mattress, the only furniture he'd managed to grab before Jessica changed the locks, Mike stared at the ceiling and tried to convince himself that this was temporary. At 40, he hadn't expected to start over. The divorce papers had blindsided him, served right after he finished his morning route for Milwaukee Uniform Service. 6 years of marriage ended in 12 pages of legal jargon and Jessica's elegant signature at the bottom. He rolled onto his side, watching headlights from passing cars paint strange shadows on the wall. The building creaked and settled around him, the sounds of age and winter. But there was something else too. A low murmur coming from room 7, the bonus room, like someone talking through cotton. The next morning, Mike Googled auditory hallucinations after divorce during his lunch break. The results mentioned stress, depression, lack of sleep, all the things his life had become a checklist for. But none of the medical websites mentioned how the hallucinations might speak of murder, of betrayal, of bodies hidden where no one would think to look. The days began to blur together in a haze of deliveries and sleepless nights, and Mike found himself watching the clock during his routes, dreading the moment he'd have to return to apartment 412. Even the familiar streets of Milwaukee seemed different now, as if the city itself was keeping secrets that he wasn't meant to know. Mike chalked it up to the pipes. Old buildings made weird noises. That's what he told himself as he drifted off to sleep, trying not to think about Jessica and the pharmaceutical rep she'd left him for. The next morning, he was back behind the wheel of his delivery van, running his usual route. The routine helped. Load the clean uniforms, collect the dirty ones, exchange pleasantries with regular customers. By the time he met Steve at Memory Lanes for their weekly bowling night, he'd almost forgotten about that strange sound. "Hey, how's the new place?" Steve asked, lining up his shot. They'd been friends since high school, when they were both too uncoordinated for football but too stubborn to quit trying out. "It's..." Mike paused, watching Steve's ball curve into the gutter. "Different. You know that feeling when you're alone, but, I don't know, you just don't feel alone?" Steve dropped onto the plastic seat next to him. "Man, if you're still hung up on Jessica..." No, it's not like that." Mike leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the crash of pins and classic rock drowning out most conversation. "Last night I heard something in one of the rooms, like someone talking, but I don't know, it was muffled. And tonight, before I came here..." He trailed off, remembering how he'd stood outside room 7, hand on the doorknob, unable to turn it. "Well, you know, old buildings, old pipes, old everything," Steve said, echoing Mike's earlier thoughts. "Remember that apartment I had in college? Hell, the radiator used to sound like it was screaming." Mike nodded, but he knew this was different. The sound had words. He couldn't make them out, but they were definitely words. That night, sleep proved elusive. Mike lay in bed, replaying Steve's words about the screaming radiator, trying to convince himself that's all it was. But as the digital clock on his phone ticked closer to 3 a.m., a familiar knot formed in his stomach. He knew what was coming. The weekend crawled by with excruciating slowness. Mike tried drowning out the nightly voices with TV static, then music, then a white noise machine from Target, but nothing worked. Each night the talking grew more insistent, more desperate, as if whatever lurked in room 7 knew its time with Mike was growing short. After the next few days, Mike tried to make the apartment feel like home. He bought a second-hand couch that smelled faintly of cigarettes, a TV that only sometimes needed to be smacked to work right, and enough kitchenware to heat up microwave dinners. But every night, the talking returned. It always started about 3 a.m. Mike would wake up, his body tense, listening to that soft, continuous murmur. Sometimes it sounded like a prayer, other times like a confession. He never could quite understand the words, but they felt heavy with meaning. On the 5th night, he'd had enough. The divorce papers had been finalized that morning. Jessica hadn't even shown up to court, and maybe that's what gave him the courage. Or maybe it was the 4 beers he drank while watching the Brewers lose. Either way, at 3:17 in the morning when the talking started, Mike got up. The hallway to room 7 seemed longer in the dark. The wooden floorboards, usually hidden under a threadbare runner, felt cold and slick against his bare feet. The talking grew louder with each step, though it maintained that underwater quality, like someone speaking through layers of wet cloth. Mike's hand shook as he reached for the doorknob. The metal was ice cold against his palm. He turned it slowly, feeling each mechanism in the lock click into place. The door swung open with a low creak. The creature stood in the corner, facing the wall. Even in the dim light filtering through the window, Mike could see something was wrong with its proportions. The shoulders were broad, the neck extraordinarily long. It wore what might have once been a suit, now green-black with age and decay. Time seemed to stop in that moment, the world narrowing to just Mike and the thing before him. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and copper, like freshly turned soil in a butcher's shop. Later, he would remember how even the ambient sounds of the city had fallen away, leaving nothing but that terrible muffled voice. As Mike watched, frozen in the doorway, it turned. The movement was strange. Not a pivot at the waist, but a slow rotation of the entire body, like a mannequin on a display stand. But the talking never stopped. The face, Mike would later try to describe it to Steve, but words failed him. The skin had the color and texture of meat left too long in the sun, pulled tight over sharp cheekbones and a too wide jaw. The eyes were milky white, but somehow still seeing. Black fluid leaked from the corners of its mouth as it spoke, words tumbling out in that same muffled tone. The suit hung in tatters, revealing patches of gray-green flesh beneath, and where the fabric had rotted away completely, Mike could see deep indentations in the torso, marks that suggested violence rather than decay. The figure's hands were twisted into claws, fingers long and joints bent backwards, like they'd been systematically broken. A thick, dark substance that might have once been blood had congealed around its collar, suggesting its throat had been cut, though the head remained attached. Mike turned to run but stumbled backwards, his heel catching the runner. He fell hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. When he looked up, the figure stood in the doorway. It didn't walk. One moment it was in the corner, and the next it was there, looming over him. The talking grew louder, and now Mike could almost understand the words. Something about guilt, about secrets, about things buried deep. He scrambled to his feet and ran. Behind him, the voice followed, no longer muffled but clear as a bell. It spoke of darkness and depth, of things hidden beneath floorboards and behind walls. Mike didn't stop until he reached his car. The morning light did nothing to erase what he'd seen. If anything, the harsh reality of daylight made it even worse, stripping away any hope that it had been a dream or a drunk hallucination. As Mike sat in his delivery van, hands shaking on the steering wheel, he knew he had a choice to make. He spent the rest of the morning in a 24-hour diner, drinking coffee that tasted like burned rubber and trying to convince himself he'd imagined it all. But when he told Steve, hours later, his friend's usual skepticism faltered. "You know, Barbara mentioned something when I helped you move in," Steve said slowly. "About the building's history. I just thought it was all bullshit, which is why I didn't say anything, but It wasn't just a textile factory. During Prohibition, it was owned by one of the bootlegging families. They used it as a front, and sometimes people who caused problems would, disappear. I think she said they called it the Milwaukee Finishing Company. Steve continued, his voice dropping lower. Not just because of the textiles. Word was if you crossed the wrong people, you'd get finished here. The cops found some bones in the wall during the renovation in '86, but the developer paid to keep it quiet. Barbara told me they never reached the deeper sections of the basement. Said the foundation was too unstable to risk digging further. Mike thought about the figure's suit, about the way its bones seemed off, like they'd been broken and reset. He thought about the black fluid dripping from its mouth, about the words that seemed to carry the weight of decades. He gave notice that very day, but Barbara just smiled sadly when he handed her the letter. "Room 7, she said, not a question. It always starts in room 7. Some people last longer than others, but everyone leaves eventually. Except for him. He's still trying to confess." Mike moved back to Steve's couch that night. In the following weeks, as he apartment hunted on the other side of town, he sometimes thought about the figure in room 7, about its endless confessions, its need to speak truths that had died with it nearly a century ago. Sometimes, late at night, he could still hear that voice, telling its story of violence and regret. And sometimes when he drove past his old building on his delivery route, he'd see movement in the window of room 7, a shadow turning slowly, eternally, speaking words that no living person was meant to understand. Jessica called once, months later, to ask about some old tax documents. After he hung up, Mike realized he barely remembered what she looked like, but he could still describe every detail of that face in room 7, every broken bone, every leaking wound. Some things, he learned, leave deeper marks than failed marriages. The apartment at 412 stayed vacant for a long time. Barbara showed it to young couples and single professionals, all drawn by the exposed brick and the included utilities. But they always left quickly, driven out by the sound of talking from room 7, by the figure that stood in corners and spoke of ancient guilt. But Mike never learned what truths the figure needed to confess. Sometimes in his dreams he understood the words. They spoke of dark rooms and darker deeds, of concrete floors and quicklime, of secrets sealed behind brick walls. They spoke of a time when Milwaukee ran red with blood and bootleg whiskey, when some men disappeared into textile factories and never came out. Some say the talking gets louder every year, as if the weight of its secrets grow heavier with time. Others claim they've seen fresh black fluids seeping through the walls of room 7, marking the brick like tears of pitch. But everyone agrees on one thing. Whatever happened in the Milwaukee Finishing Company all those years ago left a stain that no amount of paint can cover, and a voice that will never stop trying to tell its story, even if there's no one left alive who wants to hear it. The figure still stands there, they say, turning slowly in its corner, speaking its endless confession to empty rooms. And sometimes late at night, when the wind blows cold off of Lake Michigan and the old factory creaks with memories, people passing by can hear a voice, like somebody talking through cotton, like someone trying to unburden a soul long past salvation. But no one stays to listen. Not anymore. Not since Mike Denton spent 5 nights in apartment 412 and learned that some memories are better left untold, some confessions better left unheard, and some rooms better left unopened. And yet it still talks, the figure in room 7, waiting for someone to hear its truth, to understand its guilt, and to share its burden. Waiting, turning, and speaking until the walls crumble and the secrets spill out, until the last brick falls and the final confession is made. But until then, the sound continues night after night, in that small room in apartment 412, where a figure that was once a man stands in its corner and speaks of things that Milwaukee has tried hard to forget.